Nigel Wilson, Group Chief Executive of Legal & General, welcome to this series of Chief Executive interviews. We feel incredibly privileged to have you here. You've been enormously successful. I think looking back at what you've achieved in your life, it tickled me pink to find out that you're from the Northeast, of course, and that you're a massive Newcastle United fan. And I suspect the fact that you love that kind of communication has probably helped you enormously with your interpersonal skills that you've required to be such a successful businessman. At MIT, you obviously did incredibly well, moved on in the finance area with United Business Media between 2001 and 2009, and subsequently a very successful chief executive of Legal & General from 2012, where I'm pleased to say your share price has doubled in that period, which I think is a very, very considerable achievement, particularly since the banking sector itself hasn't actually done that well. If we could just take it as read that the insurance business runs itself, one of the first questions I'd like to ask you, if I may, is pensions, which is obviously a hugely significant part of L&G's business and investments. Is the education process satisfactory for teaching people that they cannot actually rely on their employers or their part-time contributions or their semi-contributions to their pensions? And going forward, because of longevity and various other reasons, they're going to have to attend to it greater. How do you feel about that?
I think that's absolutely true, and we want to make pensions as sexy as housing, because people in Britain have been preoccupied and obsessed with housing for the last 30 years. They now need to get obsessed and preoccupied with pensions, because when they retire or reach retirement, they're not going to live for another 3, 4, 5 years. They might live for 20, 30 or 40 years. And most people haven't saved enough, to be frank, and they don't know enough about how to generate income, to use their investments to create better value for themselves and the rest of their lives, or even to use their house as part of their pension. They think the house is part of their pension, but they haven't figured out how to monetize that, either by right-sizing or through lifetime mortgages. And the industry hasn't educated people enough, and they've all found it difficult to communicate to the mass market out there.
So moving on, the next thing I'd like to do before Simon deals with what I call the meat and potatoes of our interview is to ask you a little bit about where you think the UK economy is going, how you think Brexit's going to actually fit in. You were very vociferous before there was the change of Prime Minister about the huge gulf between North and South. And I think above all other chief executives, you've crystallised the problem, which is very, very strong. Do you think the new administration, Prime Minister May has said that sort of thing that actually concerns her greatly? Is she going to have the kind of policies that we actually need to sort of take this forward? And also, I thought your interview today on the Today programme was fantastic today, and you're clearly upbeat about Brexit in the long term, providing the right kind of outward investment comes in. Would that be a fair analogy?
That's a very fair analogy. I think the UK remains a great place to invest, and we've now got an even more competitive exchange rate. So there's a very good jobs market here in the UK. The interest rates are very low, the exchange rate's very competitive, and people have a lot of income, a lot of disposable income, relatively speaking. What we don't have is enough economic growth. We've got a national infrastructure plan with 450 billion of projects identified, of which we seem to have done about 1 billion so far, which is just pathetic. And so there's been a lot of intent and a lot of talk, but not much action. We've committed ourselves to at least one £15 billion fund, which is almost 1% of GDP. We spent 7 or 8 billion so far, but there's so much more that can be done. We're in the midst of a very exciting technological revolution as we move to the second machine age, and Britain has a huge role to play in that. We have some of the finest universities in the world which are producing great science. We've never figured out how to monetize them, to put real money and real capital behind the cities outside of London, the universities across the UK, and really take the startups, which we are world leaders in, and make them scaled ups, like the Americans have already done and like the Chinese are increasingly done. Yeah. So I'm very optimistic about the UK and developing a can-do attitude. We're not leavers or stayers in the Brexit situation, we're doers. And what's dragged us down in the last few years is the slowness of decision-making around the whole of Europe. there's some great ideas about being part of the European club, but it's definitely dampened the commercial enthusiasm and the need for entrepreneurship right across Europe.
Simon, do you want to develop this theme on that a little bit, particularly with your knowledge of the European Union in terms of its political and, if I may say so, its financial instability more, which may, of course, stop a certain amount of enterprise?
Yeah, thanks, David. I will, just before we get on to the as David describes it, the meat and potatoes of the legal and general business, I just want to touch on Brexit, because I think we're all Brexiteers now. It seems to be the line coming out of government. What are the real challenges in terms of the trade-offs the politicians seem quite averse to talking about? The clear trade-off between market access and migration. Do you have a preference? Do you think the fundamental trajectory of the UK economy is driven by where we sit on the continuum? Or do you think that business will simply react to whatever deal gets subsequently broken?
I think business will react to whatever deal gets sorted out. I think the EC is in need of reform. It just so happened that David Cameron went in 2016 instead of 2017. Tony Blair tried to have a referendum in 2004. He didn't implement it quick enough, and therefore France went ahead of us, and as a consequence we never had the referendum in the UK. I think there's a desire right across Europe to see a reformed EC. I think the UK has led the way and will be catalytic towards whatever an EC-light solution looks like, because we've got an EC heavy at the moment. An EC heavy is resulting in significantly less economic growth and more financial instability than the US, and indeed less economic growth than many emerging markets.
Mm-hmm. And I know you trained as an economist, so I'll ask you the question that I often battle around with David on, the difference in the Eurozone and the European Union here, and what I as an economist see as the flaws that have led to the chronic lack of growth in the European Union, which is the Eurozone and the single currency. But I'm quite pro the idea of a single market that doesn't get in the way of business and innovation. Do you see a similar split, or do you think it's all part of a broader malaise?
An intellectually correct way, so I admire your thinking on that one. I'll steal it in future conversations that I have. But the challenge is exactly that, is that there is a desire across the world to make trade more frictionless, and reducing the barriers and encouraging entrepreneurship, etc., etc. And the distinguishing parts that you made between the different parts of how Europe operates has resulted in an excess of friction and a lack of economic growth, and a tragedy for young people. We have 25% to 50% youth unemployment in large parts of Europe. That's just unacceptable, and we should be dealing and addressing that problem. We don't have that problem to the same extent in the UK, and we shouldn't get sucked into that problem. And just for foreign direct investment, the UK is still a tremendous place to invest in. We've got huge domestic markets and access to the rest of the world. And as I said earlier, great institutions, great academic institutions, property rights which are upheld and admired right throughout the world. And that's not going to go away.
I'd like to take you back to the day job and the legal and general financials. Obviously, we've had H1. There's a bit of a split in the performance between the retirement part of the business and the insurance part of the business. Is that a pattern you expect to repeat again in H2? What is the underlying momentum like?
I think our asset gathering businesses are on a tremendous roll at the moment, driven by long-term macro and demographic trends, particularly around pensions and an ageing population and the need for welfare reform, etc. And that's just going to continue. There's a relentless momentum behind that. You're right to point out our insurance business, which people haven't really focused on, has been moving slower than I would have liked for a number of years now, when we're making this transformation from being an analog commission-heavy business into becoming a digital business. And that's a difficult transformation for any industry to make, and it's particularly difficult, I think, in insurance, where there's a lot of legacy IT, which is really difficult to transform into being a digital business. In the media business, incumbents came in and transformed the industry. It's not so easy in financial services, and we've had none of the great tech firms of the world make much of a success of financial services because it's so hard. Mm-hmm. I'm very happy with the relative progress that we're making, but the absolute progress has not been as good as I would want it to be in the insurance side of our business.
Is that competitive threat from fintech, the digital community, something that keeps you awake at night? Is that something you think is coming to the insurance industry?
I think it's going to come to the insurance industry. I think it'll start more in the GI space, in home finance and car finance, which are ripe for digital disruption. I've been disappointed with fintech so far, having worked in the media business for a number of years, where the digital success has been overwhelming, and thank goodness that they haven't decided to compete in the financial services sector, because it is so difficult and does take a much longer period of time. But there's still a huge amount of work to do in our industry to get it to the same level as the media industry.
I'd like to talk about the dividend policy. It's probably something that an awful lot of viewers will be interested about in a world of chronically low yields. 6.5% on Legal & General. What's the future dividend policy? You have this, you announced H1, 30%, the interim will be 30% going forward, that fixed rules. What's the thinking at the top level of the business?
I think it's quite an unusual dividend yield for a company that's grown its earnings by 10% per annum for quite a number of years, and grown its dividends by more than that, and has pretty close to a 20% ROE. So it's almost somewhat embarrassing to talk about the performance of the business, which has resulted in a very, very high dividend yield in a world in which $12.5 trillion is invested at negative nominal yields. A 6.5% yield on the shares is a little difficult to understand. However, there's a lot of noise in the whole financial system, and part of that is the Solvency II noise, the economic capital noise, the situation here in the UK. Our shares went down a lot on Brexit. They've recovered slowly, or maybe speedily, since the Brexit discussion. So we've seen a lot of noise around our shares. I think our job going forward is to make it much clearer to investors how the businesses are performing, how they are reacting to the current situation, whether that's Brexit or Solvency II or other issues. Because we're very convinced, and indeed we hope the H1 results would convince people, that we're a tremendously resilient business. Going back to your analogy of life in the Northeast, one had to be pretty resilient to survive in the Northeast, particularly with a name like Nigel. And so we have demonstrated that, but I think we'll have to further demonstrate it in the next year to 18 months, and have this great commitment to delivering value for shareholders, even if it hasn't been reflected in the share price performance for a period of time, because the signal, the information that we've been given to the market, has been dwarfed by the noise that's been created by lots of external factors which have had an impact on our share price, and we have to get that signal to noise ratio back going forward.
And I'd like to pick up on exactly that point, because you've been critical on your blog of quarterly reporting and how that encourages firms to be short-termist, introduces a lot of noise into the system. Is that something you think that's holding back Legal & General, or but just the equity space more generally, that relentless focus on quarterly reporting, getting in the way of being able to get across to the longer-term message, which actually is what investors should really be using to allocate their capital?
Absolutely. I feel very comfortable about the way we're managing, whether it's Brexit or Solvency II or changes to pension regulation, and we've been a very resilient business with a very high performance. I don't know what. I can't see anything on the horizon that's keeping me awake at night. I see a world of opportunities, and many of those opportunities are being presented to Legal & General because we've been good at getting things done and making things happen and delivering a great performance, not just for our shareholders, but also for our customers and for the society at large.
And you mentioned some of the headwinds facing the financial sector, and I just wanted to, again, touch on perhaps something that's affecting policymakers, economists, central bankers, but undoubtedly will be something concerning your boardroom, is the legacy of negative interest rates, what you believe that may be. Clearly, with the sheer scale of government and now corporate bonds in negative territory, what problems are we storing ourselves up in the future?
Ironically, and just going back to macroeconomics, negative interest rates and very low interest rates have been bad for economic growth. And whereas historically we would have thought low interest rates would be fantastic for economic growth, and there's been a negative correlation between investments and the level of interest rates. As interest rates have come down, investments come down because of the fear that there's greater uncertainty in the future, and businesses haven't put their hands up and said, this is a great environment for investing, we're going to invest. Instead, there's been a lot of windfall gains that have gone to businesses from lower tax rate, lower interest rates, share buybacks, outsourcing, and hollowing out the middle management. And that's had an influence on how people have been able to improve the performance of their business without investing for the long term. And we've got to have an equity narrative which demonstrates you're delivering returns for the long term. And there is a wonderful background for all of that at the moment, with low interest rates, with competitive exchange rates, with well-trained labour forces, and with global economic growth still being around 3%, which is about where it's been for the last 20 or 30 years. So we're not short of opportunities of things to invest in. We just need a bit more bravery, a bit more boldness, a bit more support. And we as long-term shareholders are enthusiastic about supporting management that want to deliver growth for the long term.
Nigel, can I just nip in with something here? One thing that I find is interesting, we talked about share buybacks and delivering shareholder value. Would you be, in any circumstances, particularly as regards insurance, ever an acquisitor to add value to your business on the insurance side, or is organic growth the way you think it's?
Well, primarily, because there's so many opportunities, the organic growth is the way forward. I think if there are particular situations where we can accelerate that growth through making bolt-on acquisitions, then of course I would be supportive of doing that if it's in the interests of shareholders. But a huge amount of value is being destroyed in the financial services industry by transformative.
Banks everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah, banks particularly. When I was at McKinsey, we made a career out of pointing out that to every financial service client we had in the world, I think.
I want to take you slightly into the realm of public policy making, because you've touched on the responsibility of government and policymakers to influence the business environment. You took what I think was quite a controversial stance on flatter pension tax relief ahead of the government's during the government's consultation. You've also spoken, or certainly Legal & General has spoken, about the lessons that can be learned from auto-enrolment and spreading it wider, beverage too, and the contribution system. What do you think your role as a FTSE 100 chief executive is in terms of influencing the public policy debate? Because clearly you have some sensitivities to manage, but also a really important role in terms of steering government in the direction that you think is in the best interest of the economy.
Yeah, because I think what's good for UK PLC is good for our customers, good for our shareholders. And I think businesses for too long stood on the sidelines, not really engaging in what's been going on in the political world. And as a consequence of that, we've ended up with a huge housing shortage in the UK. We have an energy policy that nobody's enthused about whatsoever. We have a transportation policy where it resulted in inertia around where we build airport capacity. I was involved in that debate 25 years ago, and when I was asked to represent, I got out my presentation from 25 years ago, and it was still virtually wholly appropriate, which is a sad indictment on the progress that we've made. And it is hard to get engaged in politics, because ironically, business life, we've been around for 180 years, but political life can be measured in weeks or months or occasionally in years for people to have an impact. And so we sometimes think businesses are too short-term, whereas politicians has become increasingly short-term. But we have to have political leaders who have a long-term vision. We found that in the UK, in many of our great cities and towns, and indeed increasingly in our universities. We have a very exciting partnership up in Newcastle with both the university and the council. In Manchester, in Salford, we've got tremendous investment going on there, which is hugely beneficial to shareholders, hence the almost 20% ROE. But it actually is very good for the society and the local economy in those areas. We have the same in Cardiff, increasingly in Bath, Bristol, Birmingham, Southampton. There's a very long list of things that we're actively invested in. And what I'm really encouraged by is the enthusiasm that my colleagues have, who used to just spend all their time trading behind desks in front of screens, that they're out there investing in physical things. So driving big I investment, as opposed to little I interest rates. We've all, in the fund management industry, massively benefited from a 30-year decrease in interest rates. But the consequence of that has been much less investment than we'd anticipated, which is the irony of it all. I'm now encouraging all of my colleagues to go out and make things happen, because there are really good things to do for our shareholders, for our customers, but also for society at large.
And you've spoken passionately about long-term investing, but it has to be the right investment projects. And again, I'll take you back to a public statement you made quite recently about turning our back on 3 H's and embracing the 3 G's. For those people who are not familiar with those statements, can you just provide a bit of colour of why the really important projects have to be the ones selected?
Yeah, we know the importance of dropping your H's. So, no, I think it's Hinckley was clearly, I think, a project that we should invest. Is 24 billion. Is the largest single project in the world for 1 or 2 buildings for expense-wise, producing uneconomic energy. I think Heathrow, we've been stuck in a mire for 20, 30, 40, pick a time period around that, and HS2, which I'm a great believer in intracity. Crossrail, the DLR, improvement in the underground, the bus system in London. The 2 mayors have done a fantastic job of that. We want to see the success that London's had in transforming itself and roll that out across the country, and therefore getting the government to sponsor and support, but not necessarily finance, a lot of these projects, both at a regional level and a city level, is incredibly important to creating a fairer society and better economic growth. The UK is not going to grow unless the big cities outside of London have a better growth trajectory than they've had in the last 20 years. The UK has been excessively dependent on London and the South East, and that has to change going forward. And we've recognised that there is this huge opportunity, and we're actively participating in making those things happen. But we want the government to be supportive. We don't need the government's money. The world is awash with money. As we said earlier, there's 12.5 trillion with negative nominal yields on it. And we should be able to offer investors a better opportunity than a negative nominal yield. I mean, if you guys want to lend me £100,000 and get back 95,000 in 10 years' time, I'll sign you both up.
Right up.
The Swiss government are doing that deal on a daily basis, depressingly, aren't they?
Depressingly, and it's a very depressing part of society that's how risk-averse that we become, that actually people think that's acceptable behaviour and the actual optimal thing to do in the current environment, when there's an amazing amount of exciting things to invest in.
And one of the people at the very vanguard of this movement, Lord Jim O'Neill, over at the Treasury now, he's made that transition out of the business community and into now being a serving government minister. Given the undoubted passion you have for public policy making, given your track record, is this something you see yourself doing in the medium term?
Zero probability of that ever happening. I think that's, I just have no interest in that whatsoever. I'm privileged to have the job that I have. I'm very passionate about the job that I have, and I'm only part of the way through achieving the goals that we've set our company. So I'm a friend of politicians, or a friend of the chancellors of vice chancellors of various universities around the UK, in that I've got a bias towards action, and I can help them deliver often their vision of what they want to do with their communities, or the chief executives who want a better pension scheme for their employees, want to offer them a richer array of products for their employees. Really happy to do those sorts of things. Have zero interest in being a politician.
I couldn't have been much clearer. I'm just going to finish off with one final question, and this really goes to the heart of you, the CEO, you, the leader, and the kind of almost legacy, but also the advice you would give to young people starting out, either in your business or for the future leaders cohorts in Legal and General. What is the nature of the advice you give them? You've spoken about bias for action, you've spoken about tangible investment, long-term vision, but what are the softer skills that you like to see in your leadership cohorts?
I think I'm a massive believer in, information is power, but the socialisation of that information is more powerful. And so that I've always wanted open, honest dialogues with people, and intellectual honesty sits at the heart of what we do, because we want people to be really smart, we want them to be honest, but we want people to tell you, or tell me, or tell everyone, what do they really think, not what people want to hear. And so this is a very important message for people. In the short term, it sometimes got me into trouble in my own career, in my own life. But over the long term, I think being intellectually honest, having, trying to do the right things, economically and socially useful, is a very important part of what I want to achieve in my life and what I want others to, because I think they feel enriched about it. When you've helped a company float, when you've made some positive contribution to society which is economically useful, you just feel great about it. And I think there's a very high energy level at our company, a tremendous can-do attitude, and there's no blame culture. If things go wrong, ultimately it's my fault.
Nigel Wilson, CEO, Legal and General Group. Thank you very much.
Delighted. Thank you very much.
You also make a fantastic contribution to society, for which we all thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.